Here to talk about the Republican message during this 2012 campaign season, we have the chair of the Minnesota Republican Party, Pat Shortridge. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Pat, let's begin with, how do you think the lack of a major campaign in Minnesota by Mitt Romney may have affected your ability to get both legislative and congressional candidates elected?
Well, there's no shortage of enthusiasm on the part of Republicans or more conservative and moderate-leaning independents. I think there's great enthusiasm. I think there was all throughout this election cycle, and I think it especially spiked after the first presidential debate. You know, looking at the survey data and the polling, the presidential race is still a 2, 3, 4, 5-point race, depending on which survey you believe. So I think that even though that maybe the Romney campaign hasn't participated and engaged as much as I and others would have liked, I think it's much more competitive than many people would have expected. But I think fundamentally, bottom line, our candidates are doing great. They're working hard. They're talented, able individuals. And most important of all, they've got the right ideas and the right message for Minnesota's future.
And what is that message?
Largely focused on we have to get this economy going. We can't have a state that's declining, that's diminished, that's less than it can be. We have to get government out of the way, back to its proper, more limited, more focused role, so we get the government doing fewer things, but doing the few things that it really has to do them much better than it is today. That's, you know, better education, keeping good teachers in the classroom. It's reforming healthcare so that we still have the high quality healthcare delivery that people in Minnesota have come to expect as a national leader, while at the same time figuring out new and more innovative ways to finance it without government getting in the middle of the doctor-patient relationship. It's, you know, a tax system that makes sense for our future so that we're attracting new businesses and more businesses, not government trying to direct the economy with spending from St. Paul. And it's fiscally responsible budgeting, getting our state government back to a sensible, more limited scope, that we're not spending much. We're not just doing what we did last year, the year before, plus 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 10%.
Are you finding, and our candidates, Republican candidates, finding that some of the issues that affect us statewide, such as the government shutdown, the Vikings Stadium, delayed payments to schools, are these issues that Minnesotans are conveying some concern to candidates, or are they just kind of forgotten and
I think
moved
those
on?
are honestly more, in some cases, certainly the the government shutdown. I don't think our folks are hearing too much about that. I think that Minnesotans are mostly focused, as are most Americans, on how do we get this economy performing better. More jobs, more take-home pay, more opportunities for college graduates and families. How do we have better jobs? How do we, attract new industries of the future? How do we, make it easier to start and grow a business so there's more opportunity and more prosperity? And certainly, the size and the role of government's a big part of that. Regulation chokes off jobs. Schools that aren't producing the kind of workers that our employers need affects that. So I think that our candidates have been focused on the right issues, the core issues that are going to decide this election. How do you grow jobs? How do we get our economy moving? How do we get government back under control so that it doesn't get in the way of private sector job creation?
And Pat, have candidates been talking about how they would move that message forward if they are to indeed regain or remain in control of both the House and Senate here in Minnesota?
I think they have. I think they've been very clear. I mean, I think the Republican-led legislature was very clear during the last session about some of the initiatives they had moved forward, but which were unfortunately vetoed by Governor Dayton. One, a bill that started to reform and lessen the burden of taxes on job creators. Some regulatory relief to make it easier, especially when it comes to things like permitting. Education reform so that we're keeping our best teachers in the classroom and we're paying back the money that state government has borrowed from school districts so that we're not just worried about how much money is government spending on education, but are our kids actually learning and being prepared for careers in the private sector. And lessening the burden of rising healthcare costs, which is a problem both for employers as they're trying to hire and workers as they're trying to to have to pay more each month in premiums and deductibles, to try to bring some common sense and some more market-based approaches to healthcare, so that again we have both more choices, quality care, but we're not, laying a financial burden on top of employers.
We spoke with Dr. Larry Jacobs earlier in this program. He believes that Minnesotans are more polarized than ever, and many are just going to vote party line this election. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, I certainly think so. I think you've got, two very different points of view in terms of how you govern the country and what works best. The Obama, Dayton, DFL agenda, which is government directing the economy to try to have government more centrally involved in planning what's going to happen in terms of government spending, directing the economy, and in terms of St. Paul or Washington trying to pick winners and losers. And unfortunately, as Mitt Romney pointed out in one of the debates, too often government picks losers, trying to have government spending driving the economy, when instead it's got to be private employers, the private sector, and small business leading the recovery and economic growth. I mean, it's been well documented at all levels throughout this campaign. We have record high unemployment for duration purposes. We've got too many people on food stamps, too many people who can't find work. Things aren't as bad in Minnesota as they are nationally, but they're nowhere near what we find is acceptable. We always look at ourselves as an exceptional state, that we're not just run-of-the-mill, that we're not just ordinary, we're not just like everybody else. And I think Minnesotans, they're worried about that. They think we may be losing the things that made us unique and special because government is getting so big and is getting in the way of so many of the relationships we have in our lives that it's preventing the best of Minnesota from coming out.
Let's talk for a minute about the projected budget deficit. The numbers are unclear at this point, of course, for the next biennium, but given that we will have Governor Mark Dayton, a Democrat, as the leader, do you think Minnesotans are concerned at all that perhaps we might walk very close to that government shutdown line again, or that we might even cross it and have yet another one if the GOP remains in control?
Honestly, I think Minnesotans are much more worried about another very large tax increase that Governor Dayton has proposed and seems frankly to be quite obsessed with. That his one agenda item that he wants and that he continues to talk about is yet another tax increase to make Minnesota among the nation's highest tax states with the nation's top income tax rate, which makes no sense. We're not competing just with China or India, but we're competing with Florida, with Arizona, and with Wisconsin, Iowa, the Dakotas, which are booming. We can't afford, Minnesota families can't afford another great big tax increase that it's going to kill jobs and strike a blow at this economy.
So you think the shutdown isn't even
I don't think it's an issue. I think Minnesotans are happy that Republicans were able to take a $6 billion budget deficit, turn it into $1 billion surplus without raising taxes by reordering spending priorities. It wasn't a perfect solution. It wasn't an ideal set of circumstances. But in the end, this state, as with other states in this country, has to get spending under control and set some priorities for government. Otherwise, we're going to have problems every 2 years for the foreseeable future.
My last question for you, Pat, is how do you think the ballot initiatives might impact the legislative races? Do you think they might help or hurt the GOP?
Well, usually when people talk about ballot initiatives, they talk about them in terms of driving turnout one way or the other. But in Minnesota, in a presidential year, turnout's going to be very high. We show up to vote. So I don't think they're going to necessarily have an effect on legislative races. I think legislative races are determined by the quality of the candidate, how hard they work, and the message. And in our case, we've got good candidates who are working hard, who have the right message of fiscal responsibility through, tax and budget reform, getting people back to work, reforming healthcare and education as well to keep good teachers in the classroom and make healthcare affordable. And I think as long as they continue to deliver those messages at the doors, in the mailboxes, in the community, that they're going to do just great, and we'll have legislative majorities come January.
Okay, Pat Shortridge with those words. Thank you for your time, and we want to apologize to you and to our viewers for the construction noise right outside of the Capitol. It's the light rail. Can't stop progress.
Thanks for having me.